right, good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. I'm John Mark Dempsey. This is MMJ-221, which is audio production. And let's jump into what we're going to be talking about here. We're going to be, first of all, talking about basic science, analog and digital audio. So there we go. I do have a textbook that I refer to here. It's not the entire basis of everything that we will talk about, but it's called Digital Radio Production. Donald Conley, 3rd edition. You can read more about that in the syllabus. Now we will be working with sound in this class. Throughout the class, we're working. That's what we do. We work with sound, and so we're interested in the properties of sound. And so let's start with this question, which is a very interesting philosophical question, but it's also a scientific question. You may have heard it before. If a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? And what we're especially asking, does it make a sound if no one is there to hear it? So here's a video, and I hope you'll watch the whole thing. It's entertaining, but we're going to pick it up somewhat in the middle.
At some point or another, you've probably heard they said wave 3 times in the same sentence. A sound wave travels through the air in the same way that a compression wave travels through this slinky. Once the wave is released, it propagates down the length of the slinky as each coil essentially bumps into the one in front of it, transferring energy from one coil to the next. When it comes to sound waves, you can think of each of the coils on the slinky like a molecule of air. So when a tree falls in the forest and hits the ground, it transfers energy into the air molecules around it, which then bump into their neighboring molecules, and those molecules bump into their neighboring molecules, and so forth and so on, until finally the sound wave reaches your ear. And at that point, your ear generates an electrical signal, travels along the nerve until it hits your brain, and is finally interpreted as what we call sound. So to return back to the original question, and this is the important part, if a tree falls in the forest and generates those mechanical waves in the air, and no one is around, all we're left with is a defined pattern of air molecules bumping into one another, but no sound. Sound only exists in the brain. Now to be fair, this is how you perceive all of reality. Everything really just boils down to your sensory organs receiving stimuli, which your brain then interprets as different sensations.
Okay, we'll stop it there. But an interesting question, and the idea is that for sound to exist, it has to be perceived as sound. And football fans, you might think of it this way. Think of sound as a completed pass. And if a pass is not caught, it's not a completed pass. It was a pass, but it was not a completed pass, because either it fell to the ground or someone dropped it. So for sound to exist, it has to be received and perceived as sound. All right, so that gets at the process by which sound is created, and also how sound is received and interpreted as sound. So what you're seeing there in the illustration is called a sine wave, and a sine wave represents one cycle of a sine wave or a sound wave. Basically, a sine wave is the same thing as a sound wave. But the sine wave is the technical term. Here we're going to be talking about frequency, and we're looking at how rapidly, how frequently the sine wave rotates. So in that first illustration here, that's high frequency. It's rotating very rapidly. And in this illustration here, it's low frequency because the wave, the sine wave, is rotating more slowly. Okay, so and you can see how many more waves there are in the first representation than there are in the second representation. So this gets at the concept called frequency, which has to do with cycles per second. How many rotations per second of the wave. So let's have a look at this video on the idea of frequency.
Hey, what's up? It's Wick for Wikimedia Tutorials, and this season we're taking a look at spectral processors. So to really understand EQ, this episode we're going to take a look at frequencies. To get a better understanding, I'm going to use a sine wave as an example. A sine wave is the purest and simplest form of sound, and it's not found in nature, but it's really helpful when it comes down to explaining frequencies.
Okay, this is the sine wave we were talking about just a couple of moments ago, and you see the term amplitude there. We're coming to that term.
When this sine oscillates 360 degrees and makes a completed cycle, that's what we call a full cycle. The amount of completed cycles that fit in 1 second is what we call the frequency. Higher frequencies can go up to 20,000 completed cycles per second, or 20,000 hertz, which we call 20 kilohertz. We can divide our groups of frequencies simply in two groups, low frequencies and high frequencies. Low frequencies are called bass and high frequencies are called treble. The frequency range of the human ear ranges from 20 Hz up to 20 kilohertz. We do lose some of our hearing capabilities when we get older. That's why elder people can't hear higher frequencies. Let's listen to some sine waves so you get an idea of what they sound like. This is a 500 Hz sine wave. This is a 1000 Hz sine wave.
And you notice that the 1000 hertz greater frequency, the pitch is higher. And 500 hertz lower frequency, the pitch is lower.
This is a 5000 Hz sine wave. This is dropping from 1000 Hz to 75 Hz.
And you hear the pitch going down.
These are pure sine waves and they cannot be found in nature. But all sounds that are found in nature, like speech or any music-related sounds, is a composition of various sine waves at different amplitudes.
Okay, so we will stop that there. If you want to watch all of that video, it'll be available to you in this outline, which will be on my Leo 2DL, and you can go back and watch more of that. Heinrich Hertz is the person who, for whom the term Hertz is named. That's abbreviated capital HZ. Heinrich Hertz is the first person to theorize the existence of radio waves. So he is honored by having the term Hertz refer to the frequency of sound waves, or the frequency, in some cases, of radio waves, and we won't get into the difference between those right now. But because sine waves rotate so rapidly, we typically express frequency in terms of kilohertz, which is 1,000 hertz per second, or megahertz, which is 1,000,000 hertz or rotations per second. Okay? So if we're talking, and I'm a radio broadcaster, I think in terms of radio broadcasting. KGVL is an AM radio station in Greenville. They broadcast at 1,400 kilohertz. So that would be 14,000 hertz per second. Kilohertz, 1,000 hertz per second. And KETR broadcast at 88.9 megahertz, which would be 88.9 million hertz per second. So we're talking about a phenomenal number of rotations per second. How many thousand hertz or rotations per second, or how many million rotations per second? So typically we're referring to frequencies in terms of either kilohertz or megahertz. Now, sound is created from vibration, and you saw that in the first video that we were looking at about the tree that falls in the forest, and he referred to sound waves being created by molecules being disturbed and vibrating through the air. So when we create that pressure, that is called compression. That's not too surprising, makes sense. But another term that is less familiar is called rarefaction, and that is the lessening of the pressure. So when you strike the strings on a guitar, there's high pressure and those strings vibrate, and initially the sound may be quite loud. But then as the strings cease to vibrate, that's rarefaction, and the pressure is lessening. Another example is given about the wind in the trees, and you've all heard it's a beautiful sound when the wind is blowing through the trees, and the wind blows and pushes the branches forward, and that is compression. And then as the wind lessens, then the branches come back to where they were, and that's rarefactions. But that's the movement forward and backward, up and down, what have you, that creates sound. And then the size of the wave ultimately is related to the loudness of the sound, and we referred to the size of the wave, and the greater the wave, the greater the size of the wave, the greater the sound, the louder the sound, and we refer to that as amplitude. So you see that represented in the illustration that you see there. Amplitude is measured in decibels. We're going to be using the term decibels a lot in here. That's just basically the standard measurement of how loud something is. And that is named after Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone. And so it's a little bit less obvious than hertz, which kind of stands by itself, HZ, capital HZ at that. But the term decibel is something that refers to Alexander Graham Bell. And we'll get into why decibels and not just bells later on as well. Dynamic range, this is something we're not going to use all that much. It's an interesting term. It's the difference between the softest and the loudest sound of a given item. And where it really comes into play a lot is classical music, where you have passages that are very, very quiet, and then almost immediately after that you'll have a very loud passage. The orchestra will come back in full blast. And so dynamic range is an issue a lot in recording of classical music. We don't concern ourselves too much with it. Humans can hear sounds from 0 decibels or just above 0 decibels, but to above 120 decibels. But as we get to 120 decibels, then we're talking about something that probably is fairly painful. You know, if you're standing on a runway and fairly close to the jet engines of a plane, you know, you'd be experiencing sound at about 120 decibels. So let's have a look here at this video about, I'm mainly concerned here with amplitude, but he also gets into frequency and some other subjects, but this is a very good video here, but again, we're mostly interested here on amplitude.
This is what a sound wave sounds like. But what does a sound wave look like? Well, the air through which the sound wave is traveling looks something like this. But if you want another visual representation of the sound, we can hook this speaker up to an oscilloscope and it gives us this graph. We say that this shape represents the sound wave because if we focus on a single molecule of air, we see that it moves back and forth just like a sine or cosine graph. The horizontal axis here represents time, and the vertical axis can be thought of as representing the displacement of that air molecule as it oscillates back and forth. The center line here represents the equilibrium position, or undisturbed position of that air molecule. If we turn up the volume, we see that the oscillations become larger and the sound becomes louder. The maximum displacement of the air molecule from its undisturbed position is called the amplitude. Be careful, the amplitude is not the length of the entire displacement. It's only the maximum displacement measured from the equilibrium position.
Okay, so this is what we were talking about a few moments ago. Amplitude is basically the volume or the loudness of the sound, and that wave is going to look larger, is going to look bigger the louder the sound is. And if it's a very quiet sound, then it'll look very small. Now, as we do some production work later on in the semester, in Adobe Audition, if you record a very loud sound, you're going to see that on your monitor. And if you record, on the other hand, a very, very quiet sound, maybe too quiet, you're going to see a very, very small representation of the sound wave. All right, the waveform is what we call it. But again, that is measured from the middle position, what he calls the equilibrium position, to the top.
Another key idea is the period of a sound wave. The period is defined to be the time it takes for an air molecule to fully move back and forth one time. We call this back and forth motion a cycle. We measure the period in seconds, so the period is the number of seconds it takes for one cycle. We use the letter capital T to represent the period. If we decrease the period, the time it takes for the air molecules to oscillate back and forth decreases, and the note or the pitch of the sound changes. The less time it takes the air molecules to oscillate back and forth, the higher note that we perceive. An idea intimately related to the period is called the frequency. Frequency is defined to be 1 over the period. So since the period is the number of seconds per oscillation, the frequency is the number of oscillations per second.
Okay, don't worry about the formula there. Don't worry about the mathematics of it. Just know that frequency is the number of oscillations or the number of rotations of the sine wave per second. Frequency. So that's a good representation of something we've already talked about.
Frequency has units of 1 over seconds, and we call 1 over a second a hertz. Typical sounds have frequencies in the hundreds or even thousands of hertz. For instance, this note, which is an A note, is causing air to oscillate back and forth 440 times per second, so the frequency of this A note is 440 hertz. Higher notes have higher frequencies, and lower notes have lower frequencies. Humans can hear frequencies as low as about 20 hertz, and as high as about 20,000 hertz. But if a speaker were to oscillate air back and forth more than about 20,000 times per second, it would create sound waves, but we wouldn't be able to hear them. For instance, this speaker is still playing a note, but we can't hear it right now. Dogs could hear this note though. Dogs can hear frequencies up to at least 40,000 hertz. Another key idea in sound waves is the wavelength of the sound wave.
Okay, we'll pause it here. I'm not going to be too concerned with wavelength, but you get a good representation there of amplitude and frequency. There's another video also that you might find useful and helpful, and you can watch that one on your own if you want to. We're going to talk now about the ear. Obviously, the ear is what we use to hear sound, and if we can't hear the sound well, then we won't do a good job of working with sound, and so we need to take care of our ears. And this is a video on how your ear actually works, and some of the things we've already talked about come into play here.
We've always seen challenges as opportunities. That's why we're constantly evolving, empowering thousands to move better and to never give up. Whenever you need us, we'll be ready.
Many of us take for granted a very extraordinary organ, our ears. To understand the ear, we need to understand what sound is. The speakers you are listening to right now are vibrating, flexing in and out, causing a wave of pressure through the air. The frequency of these waves, or the speed at which the sound-creating surface moves back and forth, affects the pitch of the sound. The level of air pressure in each wave is directly related to how loud the sound is. The outer part of our ear catches these waves. It faces forward and has a specially designed structure of curves helping us to determine the direction of the sound and also emphasize the frequencies used in human speech. Now that the sound waves are caught, they travel through the ear canal and strike against our eardrum, a thin membrane about 10 millimeters wide. Now that we receive the sound, the middle ear transfers this energy. The smallest bones in your body, the malleus, incus, and stapes, start in motion. The malleus is attached to the eardrum, and as the sound travels along, The force is amplified by leverage until it arrives at the stapes, which acts like a reversed piston, creating waves in the fluid of the inner ear. The most significant increase in pressure is caused by pneumatic amplification. The face of the stapes has a surface area of about 3.2 square millimeters, while the eardrum has a surface area of 55 square millimeters. Using this, along with leverage through the malleus and incus, the final pressure is 22 times greater than when the sound first arrived. Now we come to the most complicated part of the hearing, the cochlea. In reality, it is coiled up, but it is easier to understand straightened out. There are actually 3 chambers inside, but let's take a look at the central part. The stapes is causing pressure waves to travel through the structure. Along the inside wall is about 20 to 30,000 reed-like fibers. As the waves move along, they encounter fibers with the correct resonant frequency and energy is released. These fibers aren't actually what give us the signal that we heard something. There is a special structure next to these fibers containing hair cells. When the fibers resonate, they cause the hair cells to move, which then sends an electrical impulse to the cochlear nerve and onto the brain.
Okay, I'm going to pause that there. Pretty remarkable process, isn't it? Just to imagine that. And this is an illustration of what you just saw in the video there, of the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. Now, this idea of compression and rarefaction, which we've already talked about, is working in your ear. And this is in the same way that speakers work very much. Your eardrum is working in a similar way. So let's see this video here on compression and rarefaction, the vibration that creates sound.
So what is sound? It's produced by vibrating objects. Can you hear that? All matter is made of particles.
Okay, we had a problem there with PowerPoint, so let me start this again. I know that's distracting. Let me start this again.
So what is sound? It's produced by vibrating objects. Can you hear that? All matter is made of particles. As the ruler bends forward, it pushes particles in the air closer together. This makes a region known as compression, which moves forward like a stack of dominoes pushed over. As the ruler moves backwards, the particles in the air move further apart, making a region called rarefaction. The ruler moves forward again, making another compression, which forces the rarefaction and first compression forwards. In this way, compressions and rarefactions move out from the ruler, making a sound wave. But it's not just a noise that we hear. We can hear if the sound is low or high, low-pitched or high-pitched. The pitch of a sound is determined by the number of vibrations produced in a second.
So what she's showing you there is that the more vibrations, the lower the frequency, and the lower the sound. And the higher the vibration, the greater number of vibrations, then the higher the sound, which is why that the sound changes, the pitch of the sound changes when she pulls the ruler in, and the vibrations are less. So watch that again.
Low-pitched or high-pitched. The pitch of a sound is determined by the number of vibrations produced in a second. That rate, or frequency, with which sound waves are produced is very important. The higher the frequency with which the air vibrates, the higher the pitch. The lower the frequency of air vibrations, the lower the pitch.
Okay, so again, compression and rarefaction. And let's see if we can get back to where we want to be, which is here. There we go. All right, this is where we left off. I apologize for problems. That may happen from time to time. So we've discussed, we had a good discussion in that video, and I don't want to try to redo that because he did much better than I would of explaining how the outer, the middle, and the inner ear work, and he gave you a good description of the hair cells that are within the cochlea that vibrate and send a signal along the auditory nerve into the brain. So until we receive those signals in the brain, then we do not perceive something as sound. Of course, it happens almost instantaneously. And that, again, goes back to what we were talking about with the tree falls in the forest. Is it sound? And the scientific argument is that it's not unless someone is there to receive the sound and to perceive it as sound. There's a nice video here on hearing loss. I think I will bypass that. You can look at it yourself. It's good. Just know that in audio production, that people do tend to work in a high sound level environment, and that can be dangerous to your hearing. So we need to be cautious about that. There are rock musicians, and Pete Townsend of The Who comes to mind. It's up in years now, but he's been playing loud music on stage for more than 50 years and is nearly deaf. So we have to be careful about that. I know in radio that a lot of us, and I'm one of them, have a tendency to like the sound in our headphones to be loud. And I've had people recoil. They put my headphones on, and I've got them set quite loud. And that's not good. That's not necessarily a good thing. So we need to be more aware of that. Recommended maximum sound pressure in the studio should be no higher than 85 decibels for monitors and headphones. Remember, we said at about 120 decibels is where you start to suffer pain. So that's a good deal less than that level of where danger is quite great. Probably even anything approaching 120 decibels. 85 is reasonable. Earplugs can be helpful if there's no other way to reduce the sound level. One of the critical listening tests is to turn the monitors down to a low level and see what it sounds like, because most people are not going to listen on professional recording studio type monitors at a very high level. What does it sound like at a normal level? That's an important way to judge it, not just what is it like at a very high level. What's it like at a reasonable, normal, ordinary level? So it's a good way to think about it. All right, so we're going to do this in two parts, and this is the end of part one, and we'll pick it up where we leave off next time. Thanks.